Got our favorite game? Oh god. Where to even begin with this? A game I like. Ni no Kuni is an amazing game. Minecraft, Breath of the Wild, and Stardew are absolute classics. And there's a ton of FPSs out there that are fun with friends. Hell, I've been getting into Ark Survival. Huh? I'm missing one? What do you... No. I'm not talking about it. What do you mean? Yes, I've been playing it every day since the second day of launch, but it's not my favorite. Plus, okay, you know what? Want to know my thoughts on it? This fucking game has taken so much of my time and hope. But okay, I can't bring myself to leave. I've been stuck in this hellscape for over a year now, whereas others would just leave like a sane human being. I don't know why, alright? Oh god, it's... Oh god, it's another obsession, isn't it? Okay, fine, I get it. On the Ikigai channel, we know what to do with obsessions, don't we?
Oh! 準備できたかな？我が名はトワクシン君なり。
You may have heard of it. Genshin Impact, known as Chinese Gacha Breath of the Wild with anime PNGs, known for the game company's sketchy and cheap nature, known for its players burning out after a while, known for its negative and even toxic fanbase. However, it's also known for its influx of downloads, known as a game that goes way too hard in its trailers, demos, cutscenes, music, and characters, and known for its involvement with its community and creative talents both in and out of that community. To me, the game is none and all of these. But I'm not going to talk about my complicated relationship with this game. Instead, I want to mainly talk about an interesting dilemma Genshin Impact found itself in. And that's the attitudes surrounding it. I gave you a sneak peek, how the game is known for a variety of things, most of which can conflict with each other, or at least undermine the other. Its player base and community often relay this sentiment, as people say the game is dying despite the influx of players and its fairly consistent revenue. Not to mention Genshin Impact's community content. We have musicians, artists, and hardcore gamers, each with artistic or purely skill-based showcasing. But there are other forms of content. To first relay, a decent part of its community has a consensus that players should play however they want, free from most outside sources of help. And there is a logic to this, mostly so that players don't waste their tears or money with the lengthy RNG grind of artifacts and weapons, encouraging focus on whatever the player thinks is fun. In essence, as the wise words of Maxor state, play as optimally as you want and have fun with what you have. However, whenever it's on YouTube, Reddit, or even HoYoLab, you see art, music, animation, and guides for Genshin everywhere. And here's the thing, they are either inconsequential or inspirative, and the guides especially are mostly helpful. Need materials? Here. Have a premeditated path to not waste your time. Is a boss too difficult? Here's how to dismantle the fucker. What's a pity system? We have a whole essay for you on the gacha systems in play. But then, there's the guides that contradict this idea of having fun with what you have, showcasing ways to completely optimize and min-max your characters. A lot of Genshin's content is also showing off or our opinions on what characters are S tier or F tier. In content like that, you'd be hard-pressed to find Amber and optimal in the same sentence, even though it arguably shouldn't matter. Seeing Traveler anything but D or F tier is laughable, and Ganyu or Hu Tao or Eula or Zhongli in the perfect team comp is more than common at this point. Regardless if you disagree or not, and to make clear, I neither hate or like this presence. The fact that these two sentiments exist for the same game remains as a discrepancy. And as I alluded to, that's not the only constant prevalent contradiction to the game and its community sentiments. While not mutually exclusive to each other, its toxic fanbase contradicts a vast majority of the community. It has a more mellow, casual side, and even an unsung creative reputation, where artists, musicians, and editors just go ham. I will admit that some of these ideas are insignificant in the wider scope of the game, such as its toxicity, which has mostly quelled over the last few months. And some are just objectively wrong, i.e. the game's death. We can debate over that all we want, but my point isn't to shed light on right or wrong here. Instead, I want to analyze why these contradictions and controversial topics arise, and how I think aspects of the game reflect on those subjects, and of course, vice versa. Much like my Girls and Panzer video, I'm not here to review Genshin, especially since it's a free game with multiple gameplay demos and trailers. If you want a review, however, look to Maxor, who is far more entertaining than me and is mostly accurate in displaying the game in the most chaotic sense. Well, except the story, of course, but that is purely my opinion, nor is it the point I want to raise. My goal is to display the complex ideas around Genshin as someone who's been playing the game for over a year, has closely observed the drama and news behind Genshin, and to try my hand at talking about video games despite my less than qualified experience in talking about them. To do all of that, I think it's best to explain what you actually do in Genshin Impact. If you've played Genshin, you probably don't need this explanation, but I want to make my context clear and help out those who may not know what the game is. First and foremost, it's a gacha game. The main point of the game is to receive characters you may want to play whenever it's due to the character's aesthetics, interesting abilities, or whatever else may be appealing about that character. To give some heart and purpose to gameplay, there's also story and events where players can participate and enhance their experience with the world, earn rewards to participate in the gacha system, or receive goodies to boost character and resource collecting. Adding to that, there are three main general mechanics in the game that keep the player going in order to play, roll, and to reward rolling. 1. Exploration. 2. Combat. And 3. Grinding. Let's touch on these one at a time. Firstly, exploration is a staple of most open worlds, where players can interact, traverse, and affect environments. Among the most notable, games like Minecraft, Breath of the Wild, and even Yakuza are hallmarks of this, whenever you are interacting with untouched terrain, traversing vast or unique landscapes, or exploring down alleyways and streets of a city. As an open-world RPG itself, Genshin's stance on this is perhaps one of the most notable aspects of gameplay. To put simply, MiHoYo clearly places emphasis on its world building and the aesthetics of it. Regions feel special, puzzles and challenges dot the map, and some sites are truly breathtaking. Of the three, Genshin places the most of its heart and effort in this portion of their game, only second to character design. Combat is our second feature of Genshin, and plays out like a JRPG-style real-time third-person engagement. However, characters are equipped with unique abilities, weapons, and attributes that spice up the game and make Genshin's combat as simple or as complex as you want. For those of you who don't know, Genshin assigns a weapon type and elemental alignment to a character, giving them unique abilities to play certain effects, and can make or break a character's viability or enjoyment. Additionally, Genshin adds a stamina mechanic that is used predominantly in exploration but also limits the amount of consecutive dodges or charge attacks you could pull off. End of all, Genshin's emphasis in combat is to be able to dynamically switch to different teammates to combo elemental reactions and boost other characters. As such, at times, Genshin Impact's combat can be fun, cathartic, and experimental, especially with a vast potential for the last one, with the different weapons, artifacts, and elemental attributes you can assign to each team member. And finally, the grind. Genshin Impact has a leveling system that lets you make characters and weapons stronger. Of course, however, you have to find and earn materials to achieve this goal. Sometimes, the players needs to collect mob drops by killing them. Other times, it's players completing combat challenges that range from a cakewalk to fucking impossible without the right characters. And other times, it's fighting bosses you find in the world. Additionally, to note a slightly debated topic, Genshin limits how much loot you could receive per day via resin. This helps pace players and arguably forces players to make the right choices to use resin on, rather than haphazardly using it. These are positives and objectively make the game playable and even fun. But as you might guess from my careful tone and wording, there are interesting flaws in the gameplay that coax criticism from people like me, despite my interest in the game's potential. Genshin Impact is a gacha game, and a fairly new one at that, but its identity as one slightly hampers its gameplay. For example, exploration. Now, I will never complain about Genshin's aesthetics in the game's environment. The game is downright beautiful in so many areas of Teyvat, but Genshin appears lacking in some of those areas. For example, most exploration aspects like oculi or chests are limited, which by itself is not a bad thing, as Breath of the Wild does much in the same. However, the difference, and by extension the issue, pertains to the fact that there's not much else. Breath of the Wild supplements its limited one-time aspects with repeatable content or mechanics so lengthy that it persists even in the endgame. There are hundreds of shrines, Korok seeds, and chests hidden throughout the world. And if you need weapons, food, or equipment, you could buy, craft, and cook these by collecting respawnable items in the world. Genshin has these scattered around, and some are even respawnable, but they are in such a small number, are limited in how often you can use them, or are not dynamic enough to have any immediate or long-term use. Additionally, Breath of the Wild and even Minecraft and Yakuza have such dynamic worlds where a player's presence can be realized and interact with that world. For Breath of the Wild, it can be seen in the smallest of details, such as cooking unique dishes, doing quests that span landscapes, or choosing specific armor sets and weapons and being able to customize them. Minecraft lets you build structures and contraptions throughout this vast world as your presence changes the landscape around you. And Yakuza has tons of minigames and quests to get you immersed in this world, some of these playing a role with each other or even in the main quest. Genshin does this, but only to a point. Cooking, for example, is dependent on the exact recipe rather than getting ingredients retaining an attribute. You can't even eat half of the ingredients in Genshin, unlike Breath of the Wild, which lets you eat everything. Oculi are useful in upgrading stamina by leveling up statues, similar to Breath of the Wild's spirit orbs. But once you reach the max level 10, every oculi you find is completely useless. Minigames do exist in Genshin, incredibly fun ones too, that let you interact with the game in non-traditional ways, and even let you rediscover parts of Teyvat that you may not often visit. Genshin had a dungeon crawler, prop hunt, and even tower defense, but only for limited time events that come around like once a year. And here's the thing, Genshin has interesting dynamic mechanics too. Elemental Sight and Vision Glow is super creative, and at least in events like the Meteor one, were genuinely interesting for tracking and detecting enemies or objects. Gliding and boating are helpful in exploration and even have a racing combat potential. The game has a few stealth sections that can prove really cool with improvement. The game even encourages players to cook and forge materials weekly. But because of the way the game is designed and what it is missing, some of these mechanics are completely irrelevant or may even seem detrimental. Then there's combat. Before talking about the combat itself, I want to preface with the fact that Genshin does scale enemies as you level up, mostly via health and damage. Additionally, many of Genshin's mid to late game challenges include time challenges, something to keep in mind as I talk about combat. We'll start with reactions. Elemental reactions often are useful and make sense. For example, Overload, where fire and electricity come into contact, deals extra fire damage and knocks opponents back. That's all well and good, but here's the problem. Swords, claymores, polearms, catalysts, and bows. These are the weapons you use to kill enemies, only 2 of which are projectile based. In a time challenge where I need to kill an enemy as fast as possible, why would knockback ever help? Especially when I need to be in striking range to do any damage. And that's just the beginning. While Overload, especially early game, feels so powerful, as you learn down the line, the reaction's damage itself is sometimes negligible in comparison to other reactions like Vaporize, Melt, and Electrocharge. Additionally, character design can range from absolutely broken to downright worse than useless. Take Hu Tao, a one-man army that has the ability to increase damage for health, lay out persistent pyro damage, can phase through enemies, can heal herself via burst, and it works in both single target and crowd control scenarios. Then, it is no surprise that she is one of the most powerful pyro DPS units in Genshin. Then we have Amber, whose kit doesn't do enough damage, abilities work too slow to kick in, has difficulty in fluid team compositions, and can barely interact with those teammates. These are 2 completely extreme examples, but the fact that it exists relays some underlying issues that Genshin raises. And unlike the dynamic choices in combat in most games, Genshin, despite the fact that you could swap out weapons and artifacts, encourages players to grind and roll for the absolutely best weapons and best artifact sets. Because if you don't, most of the time, combat grinds to a slugfest, as you can barely do damage to enemies and thus run out of time to complete the challenge. And finally, the grind. Daily commissions, bounties, and resins make sense to me. But with the amount of characters you have, grinding artifacts, mora, XP books, materials, or bosses becomes so much more selective. Not a bad thing in itself, but then you actually participate in it. Let's just say we just got a new character that we want to grind for and have no materials for it. In the game, bosses drop special ascension materials. For an average run, you only get about 2 to 3 max at the highest world rank per boss fight. And to completely ascend a character, you need 46. If you're really unlucky, that's under a full week of non-stop boss grinding. This is minus the fact that you'll need to gather other materials, XP, and mora for ascension, talents, and weapons. This also disregards new players who start at ground zero and get a fewer volume of materials. And that can be 12 days of straight up fighting the same boss over and over. To a point, this scans, as it encourages players to invest time and resources into characters you really want and get them to higher heights. But the problem is exacerbated by these other factors as well. Another thing, those special materials you get from a boss run, they are only used for character ascension and nothing else. Oh, and only for specific characters, meaning you don't even have to fight these things if you aren't anticipating that you're going to need those materials. Meaning, you are even encouraged to ignore other bosses. And sure, that sounds alright. Cool, I don't have to fight this boss and can prioritize other things. But there's also a caveat that the game is actively encouraging you to avoid a part of its content. Oh sure, those special materials aren't the only thing bosses drop, so maybe there's another reason to fight those bosses. More specialized ascension materials. Artifacts, 2/3 of which are completely useless at the endgame, and the other 1/3 usually complete with shit stats and substats. And God help you if you go for a new character who might need ascension materials from bosses you unlock 40 hours into the game. While I did put a lot of bravado in this, I believe there's a point of objectivity here. For the time it takes to fully ascend a character and level up their talents, the time can far outweigh the reward. As such, especially in artifact grinding, which is arguably worse and more RNG based than ascension or talent grinding, grinding in Genshin can feel frustrating, wasted, or disappointing. On a personal note, I made the incredibly awful decision to grind for the perfect elemental mastery artifacts for both my Sucrose and Kazuha, since they are my 2 favorite units to play with. That was 7 months ago, and to this day, to this very day, I have yet to find artifacts I feel satisfied with. There are other small issues I want to raise as well. For one, the lack of repeatable content at the end game, or when the game has a stopgap between major updates, tends to make the game rather empty for a while. While Genshin is shown to take strides in preventing this, the fact that these events are neither permanent nor repeatable still hits the game playability hard. And if I'm being honest, co-op is garbage. It's fun in some scenarios, but lacking in many others. After all, the point of co-op is cooperative play, and it's telling when there are few avenues for that. While enjoyable, Genshin's co-op combat is fun, but can burn out easily. Friends cannot help in Spiral Abyss for both good and bad reasons. Friends cannot help with exploration or quests outside residences and movement, and they cannot engage with or against each other as players outside special events or Teapot. And aside from PvP like Prop Hunt, in mechanics like Teapot, there's not much to interact with. Aside from the ease of grinding, it's difficult to even discern why even bother with co-op. Genshin has flaws, and a part of them definitely sprout from MiHoYo trying to compensate between the game's identities, a character-driven gacha, and an open-world RPG. While I want to talk about solutions, I'll be putting Inazuma before Mondstadt here, if you get what I mean. Instead, I first want to present what these problems do to expectant gamers, and eventually what this reflects upon the game. It's hard to screw up exploration, and I would personally say that Genshin's still works, especially for new players. Because of the lack of things to dynamically affect or interact with, Tevat's allure diminishes. Additionally, as this will go into both combat and grinding, certain investments are not worth it. For example, crab row. It takes 4 crab to make a single row, which you need to catch and craft. However, recipes not involving crab roe either have easier to attain ingredients or have far better effects than recipes using crab roe. Thus, why even bother going out and collecting a crap ton of crab when you could achieve similar effects for far less time and effort? Here's an even better example. Dragonspine. I'll say it, I love the idea of Dragonspine. It's a beautiful setting, presents a challenging location, and has the potential to be so interesting. But it's not worth it. Enemies, even the unique ones, drop the same thing with the same rate as any other normal creature. Frozen meat is pretty much normal meat with extra steps. Players are never there long for a good reason. The things that keep you in Dragonspine, like the agates, are one time only, and there's very little to actively interact with. Contrast this with Enkonomiya. Unique enemies with the ability to farm materials that would be rare or difficult to collect in the overworld. Day-night mechanics that reveal or open up certain areas, and players can stay for a reasonable amount of time without worrying that the environment is actively killing you. Enkonomiya is a far cry from the perfect contrast, much less a perfect region, but objectively it is a better location to play in than Dragonspine. What I'm trying to say is that Genshin has flaws involving its gameplay that hampers the general experiences of these three core mechanics. And this leads to inherent issues, not only in the game, but also situations concerning the community. As I've mentioned, Genshin's community is rather touchy and involves all sorts of camps, thought process, and individual opinions. With this in mind, I want to relay that I am speaking in general terms. No one is necessarily a problem here, and I put more responsibility on the game itself. Because when the game scaling works off of tanky enemies and forces players to kill enemies faster, of course players are going to make guides on how to optimize your characters in team comp. Of course, when we have no in-game reasons to play multiplayer, we make tier lists or make fun of poorly optimized accounts. Of course, people are going to thirst for characters or form dedicated fandoms. And of course, players expecting amazing things from this game and constantly waiting for decent content to arrive rise up in arms when miHoYo screws up. Obviously, do not harass voice actors, artists, or even developers. If you attack them with pure malice and aggression, you are channeling that anger into something harmful and honestly proving nothing. But I understand the context of it. Genshin's more shallow forms of gameplay can breed this toxic aspect of the community, where players feel they aren't being listened to and have to dig to find fun. And sure, it is there. Genshin's exploration, combat, and grinding are playable, but you have to fight for that fun sometimes. I remember how mind-numbing doing the same thing over and over again was. I know the despairing wait for any real Genshin changes, and the frustration at some of miHoYo's choices. I understand that the changes that come feel cool at best, mediocre a majority of the time, and forgettable and disappointing at worst. I believe that this sentiment is reflected in Genshin's community as players desperately grasp at leaks, guides, drama, or random content to find any fun and enjoyment from the game. New players are less affected by this, but are neutered from the future content and have to fight their way up a backlog of quests. Apathetic players simply see the game as it still was since launch, with nothing interesting being added anytime soon. And long-term players have to slog through the boredom where they basically 100%ed everything and can within a few days. Genshin itself has contradictory elements and forces players to play a certain way, and I honestly think this is more of an innocent mistake than a sinister choice. Genshin and miHoYo can be depicted as this evil, greedy company, and sure, they show that. But in this particular instance, I think miHoYo just made a mistake in game and level design, and hell, might be trying to work on that considering the new events and unreleased dendro. Hell, they're evidently trying to keep the identity, development, and worldwide influence of the game with their new sister company, hoyoverse. But regardless of intentions, the fact of the matter is that Genshin's gameplay can feel lacking or can make players feel excluded and isolated at its worst. I mean, there's practically a caste system with the world level, as it separates old players and new players. Whales and free-to-plays hold different priorities and perceptions, and those against and for the game relay antagonistic associations. While I'm not saying that fixes to Genshin can fix all of these, it practically needs some out-of-nowhere systems or dynamically game-shattering mechanics to reflect an actively positive community. A healthy game, a healthy community. It needs to rebalance so many things. It even might need to rebuild parts of its design. It's reflected in the community and attitudes surrounding that community. That community, in turn, reflects itself into the game and the varying perceptions and ideas surrounding it. Players consider it dead or dying, despite the fact that it's objectively an incorrect assessment. It's encouraged to try to siphon any fun you can, whenever that means tier lists, cranking out artifacts for the perfectly built Eula, and at worst, when the game fails to deliver, there's few places for players to channel their outrage, leading to possibly harm or obsess over elements surrounding the game. So where does that leave us? We understand the fundamental flaws of the game and its reaching effects in its player base, but that is simply a part of Genshin Impact's more whole identity. The game has shortcomings, but it's a relatively new game, a constantly updating one at that. Plus, there are places where Genshin excels. Perhaps Genshin will improve in its gameplay as updates roll out. Not so different from No Man's Sky in that regard, though I admit No Man's Sky is a bit of a special case. With a critical eye, we could discern ways it can better itself, and maybe forward our concern and ideas, solutions to improve the experience of players and the longevity of the game. To be real, MiHoYo, and now hoyoverse, a big Chinese company, probably won't notice a video as tiny as this, much less one that criticizes it more than it praises despite my interesting feelings on the game. At the very least, we can organize our thoughts, ideas, and expectations of the game, and someday that might reach the ears that want this game to grow and become something that lives up to its potential. Many of us are still here despite our frustrations. And if you know me, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about possible ideas and why we still stick with the game. And I think it'll balance out the harsh criticism of this with a more gentle and fun tone. So in the next Genshin video, whenever it comes out, I'll be wrapping up on this analysis by citing some solutions and justify them, while outlining good things that Genshin does. Because, like I said, I harbor some complex feelings with the game. I don't love the game, but I do like it. I want it to reach its potential and vision, pun not intended, and I admire that a game like this just kinda came out of left field and took the gacha and games industry by storm, and in my subjective opinion, for good and calculated reasons. If any of you out there have some ideas and opinions about the game, I implore you to share and explore them. When it comes to media, I think it's a super interesting topic, and an educational one for me. So, until then, everyone, see you in the next video.